We are in 2 Kings chapter 8. We are in the middle of the divided kingdom of Israel and Judah. Long gone are the days of Saul and David and Solomon. Born are the days of the prophets, right? And there have been prophets throughout the whole story, but we are getting into the midst of the days when there are prophets who wag their fingers in the face of kings and get onto them and prophesy that destruction is coming and that the day of the Lord is near, right? That's where we're currently at. By and large, things are not looking super good for either kingdom. We have been tracking with the northern kingdom of Israel since the end of 1 Kings, right? And so for quite some time, we've been looking specifically at the northern kingdom of Israel. And specifically, we've been looking at this dynasty descended from a guy named
Ahab.
So Ahab, yes, descended from him, but it's specifically Ahab's father, whose name is Omri. Right, so it's the Omri dynasty, but Ahab is probably the most popular person from that dynasty, and so you could call it his as well. And so we've been looking at Omri and Ahab, and then several of Ahab's sons. And the reason we've been looking at them in particular is because during this time period, God raises up two prophets in particular to stand up to these guys. Right, and the first one's name is Elijah, and the second one is Elijah's protege / disciple / successor, Elisha, right? We've talked about how in Hebrew it's easier to distinguish those. You've got Eliyahu and Elisha, which definitely sound a lot more different. But for us, in English, it's Elijah and Elisha, and we're dealing with Elisha where we're currently at. Currently, a son of Ahab sits on the throne. It's the second son of Ahab to sit on the throne because the first one died at the very beginning of 2 Kings. And we've been tracking with him for a while. But in this chapter, that is going to begin to come to an end because we are going to actually see at the end of this chapter a transition. And we're going to actually return back to the southern kingdom of Judah and see what's been going on down there during this time period. Right? And so the first half of this chapter that we're in, we're going to be dealing with some more stuff between Elisha and Israel. And then we're going to zoom over to the southern kingdom and see what's going on there. Sound good? Cool. So what I have mentioned to y'all before I actually started recording and stuff like that is that ideally, and I don't know if we're going to be able to accomplish this, if we can get through this chapter at a relatively quickish pace, when I say quick, I mean like an hour and a half if possible, then I would like to take some time to maybe also do an overview of the book of Obadiah. Because there are some events that happen in this chapter which could potentially be relevant to the events that we see described in the book of Obadiah. And one thing that I've been wanting to do as we go through 2 Kings is give us overviews to that. If we do end up having time for that, then what I probably will do is I will indicate that to y'all before we go into it, because I'm probably going to create 2 different videos for online, just so y'all know. Another thing I want to do in between that is I want to very briefly touch on some cool archaeological stuff that we have related to the story here. We're starting to get into certain parts of the Bible where we are getting a lot of archaeological evidence, right? Just because by the time you get to really like this back half of 2 Kings, since we are dealing with such like large scale things and the people of Israel and Judah are such established people at this time, we actually begin to hear them being mentioned in, other nations, like records and stuff like that. And so it's really cool. Whereas, earlier, you wouldn't expect them to be mentioned as much because they were just a growing nation and we don't really see them in conflict with like giant nations, right? Whereas now, we do see them coming into conflict with them and therefore it's going to start showing up, which is kind of cool. But that being said, I guess we'll hop in here. It makes me sad that Sean's not here because we don't have our regular Bible reader. But that's okay. I'll fill in for now. All right. 2 Kings chapter 8, verses 1 through 6.
I'll read.
All right, go for it, Rocky. Read loud so that they can hear.
Loud and proud.
Loud and proud.
Now Elijah spoke to the woman whose son he had restored to life, saying, "Arise and go to your house." And how do you pronounce that?
Sojourn.
Sojourn. Wherever you can sojourn. For Yahweh has called for a famine, and it will even come on the land for 7 years. So the woman arose and did according to the word of the man of God. And she went to her household and sojourned in the land of the Philistines 7 years. Now it happened at the end of the 7 years that the woman returned to the land of the Philistines, and she went out to cry out to the king for her house and for her field. Now the king was speaking with Gehazi, the young man of the man of God, saying, "Please recount to me all the great things that Elijah has done." Now it happened, as he was recounting to the king how he had restored to life the one who was dead, that behold, the woman whose son he had restored to life was crying out to the king for her house and for her field. Now Gehazi said, "My lord, O king, this is the woman, and this is her son, whom Elijah restored to life." Then the king asked the woman, and she recounted it to him. So the king appointed for her a certain officer, saying, "Restore all that was hers, and all the produce of the field, from the day she left the land, even until now."
Perfect. Thank you, sir. All right, so what happens in this little story here?
So the Shunammite woman from, I believe it was chapters 3 and 4?
That sounds right.
4, I think.
Chapter 4.
Chapter 4.
Yeah.
Okay, so the Shunammite woman who we first met back in chapter 4 gets foretold of the famine that's going to come, which we saw in the last 2 chapters. And so she goes to the land of the Philistines, to the west of Israel, and basically camps up there for 7 years during the time of the famine, so that her land and all that Elisha had given her isn't affected. So when the famine's over, she comes back and she goes to the king of Israel, who is now being advised by Gehazi, who left Elisha's company after everything that had happened with Naaman, and that he had, gained the leprosy, and he had now become
A leper himself.
a leper himself.
Yeah.
Yes. And so when the lady was talking to the king, Gehazi was recounting everything that Elisha had done for her, and the king eventually said to, give back the land that had once belonged to her.
Yeah. So this is actually a very interesting story for several different reasons. One thing that I want you to keep in mind, because this is going to come up several times in this chapter, is the movement of God, of Yahweh, from the Jews to the Gentiles, right? Because we're going to see this specifically, really going into verse 7 and stuff afterwards, but we even see a hint at it here at the very beginning, whenever we're going to see the Shunammite woman go into the land of the Philistines, right? One thing that, and this goes way back to Deuteronomy 32, whenever Moses prophesied over Israel, he basically said that whenever Israel rejects God, God's going to do 3 things, right? Whenever it gets really bad. First off, he's going to hide his face from them, so he's going to conceal himself. Secondly, he's going to afflict them, and to the point of near destruction. And thirdly, he says that he is going to take himself to the Gentiles, right? He says, if you're going to make me jealous with what is not a God, I will find another people to bless, right? If you reject my blessing, I'll bless somebody else. And we're going to see that movement continues in this chapter, right? And we kind of saw that already with Elijah a little bit, right? If you remember, during Elijah's time, when there was a famine, he went up to a place just outside of Sidon, right? The widow of Zarephath, right? And he was there. And so he was ministering to a Gentile woman outside the land of Israel. And Jesus himself even highlights that with Elijah whenever he's preaching in the synagogue of Nazareth. But we see this movement that as judgment against Israel for their sins, God's prophets are beginning to minister more to Gentiles, right? And like I said, we're going to see that especially going into verse 7 and onwards, But we see a hint at that right here, and I'll explain why.
And we already saw the affliction aspect.
Yes, because you're talking about like the famine, right? And so the famine that is mentioned here, we can't be confident about this, but we have good reason to believe that the famine being mentioned here is probably the same one that we saw the effects of in chapter 7, right? So probably, like we naturally like to read things like kind of just chronologically, but we can almost imagine that the events of chapter 8 kind of span the entirety of chapter 7, right? Chapter 7, you saw the tail end of it, whereas chapter 8 began before chapter 7, but it ends after. Yeah. Because a 7-year time span happens over the course of it. So let's go through it. Now Elisha spoke to the woman whose son he had restored to life. Right? And this just is meant to call you back to the Shunammite woman, like Nick mentioned back in chapter 4. If you remember, this woman, she basically had invited Elisha over, and he was really impressed with her. And he said, like, hey, ask anything of me and I'll give it to you. And she had said, I don't really want anything. And then Gehazi, remember, he was still following Elisha at the time, and he said, this woman, she really, like her husband's really old, and she doesn't have a kid. And so there was this kind of understanding that she could really use a kid so that whenever her husband eventually dies, she has somebody to provide for her, right? And so, ultimately, Elisha promised her that she would have a child, and she did have that child. But then if you remember a little bit later, one day the boy is out working with his father in the field, and he says, my head! And then he falls over dead. And it's this crazy thing where the woman takes the kid up and lays him down in a chamber where Elisha used to stay, and then the woman goes to get Elisha, and Elisha's confused by the whole situation because usually Elisha is aware of all the things that God is going to do, right? Because usually God doesn't do anything without revealing it to the prophets. But even Elisha's like, whoa, I don't know what's going on here. And so he sends Gehazi ahead of him to go and check on the boy, and Gehazi tries using the staff of Elisha, but it doesn't resurrect the boy. And it's only whenever Elisha gets there and he lays on the kid like 3 times that finally the boy sits up and he sneezes 7 times, I think it is, and the boy comes back to life, right? And so whenever it says the woman whose son he had restored to life, it's just calling back to that, right? For us, that was like over a month ago that we studied that. But if you're just reading through 2 Kings, it was literally like 2 pages ago. And so it would feel a lot more condensed. So Elisha spoke to the woman whose son he had restored to life, saying, arise and go with your household and sojourn wherever you can sojourn. For Yahweh has called for a famine, and it will even come on the land for 7 years. All right. So let's talk about that real quick. First off, what is he telling her to do?
He said leave because there's going to be a famine that's going on for 7 years.
What does the word sojourn mean?
Travel, basically.
It means to travel, but specifically travel where?
To a foreign land.
So travel to a foreign land. Travel into a land that is not your own.
Like the
right?
Egyptian sojourners that were with the Israelites.
Yes. And so this is what I think is so interesting. This is where we see this movement to the Gentiles. Is that, does Elisha tell her a specific place to go? No. He just says anywhere but here. Which implies that where is the famine only going to affect? Israel. Right? And if there's a famine going on in Israel, what does that mean?
They've sinned and God's mad at them.
They're sinning against God, and this is judgment, right? This is what this is all like the Torah worldview, right? Deuteronomy 28 worldview. If you've read that, then you'll be like, okay, if there's a famine, things are bad. But things are getting so bad that God isn't even afflicting the Gentile nations, right? Apparently the Gentiles are chilling. It is only Israel that he's afflicting. And so Elisha says, get out of this land. Sojourn anywhere, because in this land for 7 years, things are going to be bad. And like I said, we kind of saw the effects of how bad it was, right? We saw how bad things were in chapter 7. It got to the point where people were literally eating their babies, right? And so it got really, really, really bad. And then we got to see ultimately how Elisha also delivered them from that, literally overnight, right? Well, God delivered them by the words of Elisha overnight. But let's talk about the 7 years thing. What's up with that?
7 years.
You don't want to read into everything too much, but usually the number 7 isn't accidental in the Bible.
Seventh day, the Sabbath.
Yeah, it is almost like God is forcing a Sabbath upon the land, right? But it's almost like a reverse Sabbath, where it's like rather than the land experiencing the rest from the people's work, the land itself is suffering because of the sin of the people, right? So it's almost like the land itself is being judged because of what the people are doing. Or you could view it as for 7 years, the people themselves will not experience any true Sabbath, right? This is their affliction. The Sabbath was a gift by God to man, right? And now for 7 Sabbath years, they're not going to have it, right? And so you got to read it anyway like that. But for 7 years, there's going to be a famine, and it will come on the land. So the woman arose and did according to the word of the man of God. And she went with her household and sojourned in the land of the Philistines for 7 years. All right, sorry, my phone was like going crazy. So what does she do?
She leaves.
She leaves, and where does she go?
To the land
To
of
the land of the Philistines.
Land of the Philistines, which is also really, really, like this kind of damning of the people of Israel, especially whenever you consider who the Philistines are, right? The Philistines were like their first big enemy, right? And it's not a good sign whenever the faithful people of Israel are fleeing to the Philistines, right? The word Philistine literally means invader, right? These are historians know them as the sea peoples, right? These are probably people we don't really know where they came from. Most likely they came from like Greece or something, and they literally just traveled across the Mediterranean and they invaded all sorts of different places. And the Philistines are one group of those peoples, right? And they were literally invading inwards, and so they're right down where modern day, where we would say Palestine is at. That's where Philistia was at, and because the word Palestine literally comes from
It's Gaza,
Philistine.
pretty much.
Yeah. And so that area, that's where the Philistines are at. And to me, this kind of calls back in the story of David. Whenever David was on the run from King Saul, David also sojourned in the land of the Philistines for a while, which also was pretty condemning of Saul. Like, if the anointed man of God has to flee to the Philistines for comfort, you know that Israel's is bad, right? That's not a good sign. Whenever the Philistines are being blessed by God more than the Israelites, we got a bit of an issue. But that's exactly what's happening here. So she went and did that. And now it happened at the end of 7 years. So we fast forward 7 years. So we are now after the events of chapter 7. Now it happened at the end of 7 years that the woman returned from the land of the Philistines. And she went out to cry out to the king for her house and for her field. So what is she going to do?
She pleads for her land and for her house.
Yeah, why does she need to do this?
Because it likely got claimed by other people. Like,
Yeah.
Pretty sure there's something in the Levitical laws about that.
Yeah, so pretty much if you ever just leave your property for a certain amount of time and just leave it untended to and stuff like that, the government, and this is true in pretty much any culture,
Yeah.
and I think you are correct, I think there is a Levitical law talking about this, but in pretty much any culture, the government's going to take possession of this, right? They're going to take possession of it, they're going to do something with the land. This woman was gone for 7 years, and so she finally comes back and she does not have a home to return to. And so she goes to the king to make her case.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what's so surprising about this story. Because from what we've seen about the king so far, what would we expect of him?
You just say no.
Nah, not happening.
Yeah. He would say, you know what, forget you, go home and just or don't go home, just go die in a ditch or something, right? Because she has no home to go to.
Sell yourself into slavery.
Yeah, because so far what we've seen about this king is that he's not really a great guy. There's been several times where he's tried to have Elisha killed, and
You blamed him for the famine.
yeah, even so, literally going back into chapters 6 and 7, he blamed Elisha for the famine, and we know that was at the tail end of the famine. So that was a very recent event. But what's pretty cool about this is that, as we saw at the end of chapter 7, is that this very miraculous thing happened, where overnight the famine was lifted according to the word of Elisha, and it seems like the king, in many ways, has had a little bit of a change of heart, to where his disposition towards Elisha is radically different. And
For now.
yeah, for now. But what's so surprising about this is that we are actually going to see the house of like Omri at its like highest right here. We are actually like, this is the first time that we are going to see a member of the house of Omri actually engage in justice, right? Like not injustice, in space justice, right? He's actually going to do the right thing here, which is crazy. Like it should surprise you. And then what should surprise you even more is that whenever you go to the next verse, into verse 7, you have Elisha departing into the land of the Gentiles, which is in many ways a judgment on the people of Israel. So here you have this king, this corrupt king, who seems to be on the verge of repentance, and right then, the judgment from God lands. It's kind of interesting. But this is what happens, right? So you can imagine the woman. She is making her way up there to visit the king, but he doesn't know that yet, right? Meanwhile, if this were a movie, while she's making her way up there, we cut inside the palace. And the king is just talking to one of his attendants. And we recognize this guy because he's a leper. And that's kind of, I don't really know how this worked. If he's a leper, I don't know why he's allowed to be so close to the king or something like that. But you know what? Maybe they weren't following the purity laws.
They must have forgotten about the laws around cleansing.
Yeah.
Despite the fact that the last time during the famine, the lepers were outside of Samaria.
Yeah.
So in that regard.
Yeah, kind of strange. I don't know. It's a very odd situation there.
Maybe
Unless we were going to assume that maybe the events with Naaman happened after this. In which case, I'd be surprised by
that
that.
would make sense.
Yeah, I don't know. Like just because we have Gehazi not really with Elisha, I don't know. It's kind of confusing, but anyways.
I think the king did an oopsie daisy.
Yeah, probably. Now the king was speaking with Gehazi, the young man of the man of God. See, that's the phrase where I'm saying it could imply that maybe he is still following Elisha at this point. But I think there also is this narrative beauty to the idea that he is a leper and is attending to the king. Just because, if you remember, Naaman the leper was also the attendant to the king of Aram. And we're also about to go revisit Aram in the next story. And so it seems like, most likely, for some reason, Gehazi is a leper, and he's no longer following Elisha. I don't know, it's very strange. Like, the chronology of it and the method of it, it's kind of weird. But, long story short, the king and Gehazi are speaking to one another. And the king says, please recount to me all the great things that Elisha has done. He actually seems interested in Elisha here. And he's like, hey, tell me more about the things your master did. Like, he actually just wants to hear these stories recounted. It makes you wonder if he's heard these stories before, or if he was always so blinded by his hatred for Elisha that he was never really willing to even give him the time of day. But now that maybe his heart is a little bit more softened, he's like, hey, tell me about this Elisha guy, right? You spent so much time following him. Tell me the things you experienced. And this is where it's going to get really cool. Now it happened that as he was recounting to the king how he had restored to life the one who was dead, that, behold, the woman whose son he had restored to life was crying out to the king for her house and for her field. Now this is pretty cool, right? So Gehazi, we know that the whole leprosy thing was punishment for him being greedy, but that doesn't mean that he just totally apostatized and turned against God or anything like that. It seems like in general, he still liked Elisha, and he did something sinful and he was punished for it, right? Bless you.
Thank you.
And so the king says, tell me about Elisha. And he says, man, I saw so many crazy things with Elisha. And he starts telling one story after the next. And he's like, oh man, and here's the craziest one of all. There was this woman, right? And she didn't have a kid. And so I told Elisha, hey, she could use a kid. And she had the kid, right? And then the kid, he hurt his head. Oh, my head. And then he fell over dead. And then the woman came and she came to Elisha, and Elisha sent me ahead, and I put the stick on the boy, and the boy didn't come back to life. But then Elisha, man, he showed up, and he laid on the boy 3 times. And then the boy, he sat up, and he sneezed, get this, 7 times, and it was crazy. And then as he's in the midst of telling this story, there's a knock on the palace door. King, there's this woman here to see you. All right, let her in. The woman comes in. And Gehazi's like, sir, I kid you not. That is the woman I was just talking about. Coincidence? I think not. Right? It's almost like all of this is being orchestrated by God to perfection. And it's almost like this is all a test to see where the king is at. Right? It's almost like God wants to force this interaction to where the king has gotten to witness God's grace to this woman and God's immense desire for this woman to be provided for. Right? God provided for the woman miraculously once. Right? He gave her a child. He resurrected the child. God has made it very clear this woman needs to be taken care of. And now this woman comes before the king with a request. It's a test. All right. How are you going to respond? Are you going to respond like you used to would have and just tell her to go, just fend for herself? Or are you going to provide for her? And surprisingly, the king's going to pass the test. That's what's crazy. And Gehazi said, "My lord, O king, this is the woman, and this is her son, whom Elisha restored to life." Her husband isn't there, and so I think it's probably safe to assume that by this point her husband has died. But the woman and her son are there, and this is like evidence for the fact that his story is true. Because now you can imagine the king's like, okay, so I just heard a story about you. Now tell me your side of things. And then if they tell the exact same story, now you've got two witnesses who have testified to the same thing, and the king knows this it's not just a fairy tale. Right? It's like, oh, this is actually a legit thing that happened. This is cool. And so they recount. The king is forced to see these people, and then the king asked the woman, and she recounted it to him. She says, "Yeah, that's exactly what happened. This is my son. He was dead, but he's no longer dead, and God has been faithful to us. In fact, the reason we lost our land is because Elisha warned us ahead of time that a famine was coming. And so he told us to get out of Dodge. And so we did, but we're back because we heard the famine's over. Is that true?" "Yeah, it is true." "Oh, well, cool. So can I have my land back?" So the king appointed for her a certain officer, saying, "Restore all that was hers and all the produce of the field from the day that she left the land, even until now." So not only is he restoring land, what else is he restoring?
All the food that would have grown there from,
Yeah. And to be fair, that probably wasn't a lot of food because it was during a famine. But still, he's not just giving them the parcel of land. He's basically saying, give them everything, right? Don't clean out the land before you give it to her. Give her it as it currently is, right? With all the produce, with all the things that you've stored up there, give it to her like that. Provide for her. That's pretty cool. Right? I mean, it's like, well, sweet. The king is actually doing something godly. Like, huzzah! Good job, O king. And now we're going to continue the story. Rocky, take it away.
Oh boy.
Then Elisha came to Damascus. Now, Ben-Hadad, right?
Mm-hmm.
King of Aram, was sick. It was told to him, saying, "The man of God has come here." The king said to Hazael, right?
Mm-hmm.
"Take a present in your hand and go meet the man of God and inquire of Yahweh by him, saying, Will I be restored to life from the sickness?" So Hazael went to meet him and took a present in his hand, even every kind of good thing of Damascus, 40 camels loads. And he came and stood before him and said, "Your son Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, has sent me to you, saying, I will be restored to life from this sickness." Then Elijah said to him, "Go, say to him, you will surely be restored to life. But Yahweh has shown me that he will certainly die."
Alright. Oh.
And he fixed his gaze steadily on him until he was ashamed, and the man of God wept.
Alright. Cool. So, what happens here?
Elisha goes to Aram, or Damascus rather. I don't know.
Damascus is the capital of Aram.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
And Ben-Hadad is sick, and so he sends whoever this guy is. I'm not sure if he was mentioned earlier, and I just don't know the name.
He's mentioned one time. I'll pull it up in a second.
But he basically tells this guy, hey, go talk to Elisha, inquire of Yahweh, which is interesting that he's inquiring of Yahweh, since we know that he used to worship a different god, at least for a little while. And he's like, ask if I will recover from the sickness or not. And in an interesting twist of fate, Elisha says, you will recover from the sickness, but the Lord has revealed to me that he will still die. And then he stared at Hazael until Hazael got ashamed, and then Elisha started weeping.
Kind of a weird note to end on, right? And to be fair, I did kind of cut this paragraph in two,
Yes.
but I wanted to end it right there just because it's kind of a very curious note to end on. But yeah, so going right into this, I do find it very interesting that this moment right here is actually a crucial shift in the story of Scripture, because this is the very first time that we have a prophet directly ministering to a leader in Gentile territory. Right? We have had like people like Elijah ministering to like widows in Zarephath, but this is the very first time that we have a prophet of God from the land of Israel leaving the land to minister to a king of another nation.
Not just any prophet, like we've talked about in the previous weeks. He's essentially a walking
Temple.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, he is the man of God. Right? That's why it keeps calling him that, right? He is the God man. Right? Where he goes, God goes. And now we have literally God exiting Israel and going to the palace, like literally the capital city of what at this time is one of Israel's number one enemies. Consider the fact that in the previous chapter, Aram was laying siege to Samaria. Right? That was them. Right? And so Aram and Israel, they're not on good terms. The only reason that Aram left is because God miraculously made them think that Israel had backup. Right? And what's also interesting is that Aram also, remember the king of Aram, Ben-Hadad, he also tried to have Elisha killed in the last chapter. Right? Or I don't know if that was the last chapter or the one before that. But remember that was whenever the city was laid siege. And
I think it was chapter 6.
Yeah, I think it was 6. Where like that's when they were the armies of God.
Yeah.
Right? And so there's a history behind this. Right? Ben-Hadad has tried to have Elisha killed. And fairly recently in their history, they laid siege to like Israel. The only reason why I think that Elisha can even walk into Damascus so easily is because if you remember in the instance when Ben-Hadad did try to have Elisha killed, he actually led the Arameans back to Samaria, and then he commanded the king to provide food for them. Right? And so he actually, so Elisha in many ways was a peacemaker. Right? To where he demonstrated that he has nothing against the Arameans. And so even though the Arameans laid siege to Israel, it seems like they don't have an issue with Elisha himself.
And also after they had laid siege and they fled, they basically left everything behind, like all of their supplies and all their wealth, the provisions that they had brought for the siege. They left it all in Israel. Like everything was left west of the Jordan.
Yeah. Yeah, and so what's very interesting here is that in many ways Elisha looks like a turncoat, right? Like here, I mean, like on one hand, you have the king of Israel who for the first time is doing something that sounds really good. And then in the very next verse, you have the prophet of God leaving Israel altogether and going to their number one enemy to help him out, seemingly.
Yeah.
That's strange. So then Elisha came to Damascus. Now Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, was sick. Remember, Ben-Hadad just means son of Hadad. Hadad is one of their kings. Ben-Hadad seems to have just been like a title for a king, right? Hadad is one of their gods, right? So Ben-Hadad is just son of their god, right? He was the king of Aram. and he was sick, adding to the number of sick kings that we have seen already in the book of Kings. And it was told to him, saying, the man of God has come here. That's interesting. So Elisha's reputation precedes him. They don't even say his name. The man of God is here. Oh, Elisha. Cool. And the king said to Hazael, take a present in your hand and go meet with the man of God and inquire of Yahweh by him, saying, will I be restored to life from this sickness? Now, the way that Hazael is introduced here makes it sound like we're supposed to know who he is. Because it doesn't say he said to Hazael his attendant or anything like that. It just says he said to Hazael. So the question becomes, have we heard of Hazael before?
I don't remember.
Me neither.
Not in 2 Kings we haven't. This goes way back to 1 Kings. And it goes to the ministry of Elijah. This story right here has been a long time in the making. Right? You remember that moment whenever, right after the whole Mount Carmel incident, when Elisha called down fire from heaven? And then shortly afterwards, Elijah fled down to Mount Sinai. Right? You remember that? This is what we read in 1 Kings chapter 19, starting in verse 13. And behold, a voice came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? Then he said, I have been very zealous for Yahweh, the God of hosts. For the sons of Israel have forsaken your covenant, pulled down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I alone am left, and they seek my life to take it away. So Elijah says, God, I've been zealous for you, but I feel alone. And Yahweh said to him, go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and you will arrive and anoint Hazael king over Aram. And Jehu the son of Nimshi you shall anoint king over Israel. And Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel Meholah you shall anoint as prophet in your place. And it will be that the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall put to death. And the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. And so, whenever Elijah returns, you see him do a lot of those things. But you know what he does not do? He does not anoint Hazael. Because it seems like it was made evident to Elijah that it was not the time to do that yet. Right? God was speaking about what was going to come in the years to pass. And finally, Elisha has received the go-ahead to go do it. Right? So Elisha is the one who goes to Damascus. And this guy named Hazael right now, he's not a king. He is simply a man in the king's courts. But we know something even Hazael does not know yet. Right? That's why it doesn't have to introduce him. And the king said to Hazael, we're supposed to be like, oh, this guy is going to become the king. Right? So we already know something that even Hazael doesn't know. Hazael is just an attendant of the king. And the king said to Hazael, take a present in your hand and go and meet the man of God and inquire of Yahweh by him, saying, will I be restored to life from this sickness? So it seems like the king of Aram has come to recognize that Yahweh is a pretty powerful God. A God who seemingly has power over even disease itself. And so he says, hey, take a gift, go give him some money, just so he knows that I mean peace. Offer him some sort of tribute, because, I don't know, he doesn't want like a free handout, right? He's not acting like he's entitled to an answer. Even though he is a king, he is subjecting himself to the prophet, which is kind of interesting, given the fact that we know that the same king laid siege to Samaria, right? It's like this king has more respect for the prophet than he does for another king. And he has more respect for Yahweh than even the king of Israel does, right? So it's a very interesting dynamic. So take a present in your hand and go and meet the man of God and inquire of Yahweh by him, saying, will I be restored to life from the sickness? So he just wants to know, am I going to live? So Hazael went to meet him and took a present in his hand, even every kind of good thing of Damascus, 40 camels loads. He must have a really big hand. 40 camels loads, and he came and stood before him. So just the idea, 40 camels loads, that's the idea, that's a lot of stuff. I mean, it's not saying that he's getting to keep the camels. I mean, maybe, might as well.
Whole caravan.
Yeah, no, this is a lot of stuff. This king is bearing, like, he's holding back nothing.
Yeah, it's like, here's my entire treasury.
Yes, especially because we also saw in the last chapter, like you mentioned, they already lost a lot of stuff in that last battle, so it's not like they're just like overflowing with stuff. But yeah, so he came and he stood before him and he said, "Your son Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, has sent me to you." You get the idea that Elisha's probably getting older at this point, right? The fact that the king is being called his son, right? Not your brother, not just your servant, your son. "Your son Ben-Hadad, king of Aram, has sent me to you, saying, will I be restored to life from this sickness?" All right? So he asks a pretty simple question. Will I be restored to life?
Pretty standard stuff. We've seen kings ask questions like this in the past, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And Elisha's answer is going to be kind of funny. And very tricky. He gives a very trickster answer. In Hebrew, the question is literally, will I live from the sickness? Right? Like, will I continue to live? Then Elisha said to him, so he says to Hazael, "Go say this to the king. You will surely be restored to life, but Yahweh has shown me that he will certainly die." In Hebrew, it's even funnier to me. Because, whenever you see the words like surely or certainly in Hebrew, usually that's not the word that it's actually translating. Usually in Hebrew, it's repetition, right? So if it says surely live, it's really live. And if it says certainly die, it's die. And so what it says in Hebrew is, go say to him, you will live, but Yahweh has shown me he will die. So like I just think that's funny. It's emphasizing the confidence of it, right? And so a question arises here. Is Elisha commanding this man to lie?
Well,
It's not a lie.
it's not a lie. I kind of read a little bit ahead because I'm like, I look at that and I'm like, what the heck is going on?
Yeah.
And from what I've seen, it's like he's not gonna die because of the illness. Like the illness is not gonna be the reason he dies.
Yes. This is kind of like Obi-Wan in A New Hope. When it's like, from a certain point of view, I told you the truth. Whatever. Like whenever he's like talking to Luke and he's like, yes, your father was a great Jedi Master until Darth Vader killed him. And it's like, that would have been the perfect opportunity for Obi-Wan to clarify, by the way, your dad is Darth Vader. And like, when you get to Return of the Jedi, that's where Luke's like, bro, what the heck? And Obi-Wan's like, well, from a certain point of view, I wasn't lying. It's like, okay, but Obi-Wan, like, you knew what you were doing there, right? Like, you were intentionally being very vague.
Even Luke calls him out on it because he's like, a certain point of view?
Yeah.
He's like, are you kidding?
Yeah, it's like a technicality. But that's exactly what Elisha's doing here, right? It's a technicality. He says, no, tell him he will live. But Yahweh has shown me he will die. So it seems like the clear thing, like he should just say you're going to die. Because that's ultimately, does the king really care about how he dies? No, he just wants to know if he's going to live or die. But that's not what he asked. He said, will I live from this sickness? Well, yeah, you will live. Yeah, this sickness ain't going to take you out. Something else is going to take you out. Right? So, what's that?
Or someone.
Yeah, or someone. Maybe the person that you sent over here to ask me. Right? And so, that's what's so interesting about this. It's like, I love the prophets. Because I feel like whenever you read the Old Testament prophets, you get so much more like character and I think it's very easy for us as Christians to, be like overly serious about everything. And whenever we like over theologize things, and like obviously theology is important, right? I love theology. But sometimes we become very like wooden and dry, and like we allow our studying of the Bible to like seep out our personalities. Whereas I feel like whenever you read the Old Testament prophets, whether that be in Kings or in like the actual books of the prophets, you can't help but be like, oh man, these guys were having a great time. Like they were miserable a lot of the times, but like they knew how to have fun when they were trying to have fun. Like they're just like the wordplay and the sarcasm. It's just really entertaining to where you're like, oh, okay, like it lets you know that there are different Like the people of God, we can be unified without all looking exactly the same, right? There is a time for sarcasm, and there is a time for vagueness, right? I just think that's interesting because Elisha could be clear, and he could say he will live from the sickness, but he will die from something else. But that's not what he says. He says, okay, your master has asked me if he will live from the sickness. To that, I tell you to go tell him, yes, he will live. That's what I want you to tell him. Side note, just between me and you, God has told me he will die. But you don't have to share that part with your master. But in answer to his question, yeah, he's going to live. But just from the sickness. Something else is going to take him out. And so I just think that's really, like, I don't know. I don't really know where else to go beyond that, beyond what I've already said. But I just think that's kind of fun. It just adds some spice into things.
I also find it funny that Elisha doesn't tell him that, like, she can't remember. Doesn't tell Hazael that he's going to be the guy who kills the king.
Yeah.
He's, I mean, when he says that the king is going to die, he's essentially looking at Hazael like, yeah, pretty much.
It's like,
Where he's just like, yeah, the king's going to die.
yeah, that's true. Oh yeah, I mean, literally, just to go on to the next verse. And he fixed his gaze steadily on him until he was ashamed. And the man of God wept. This is such an interesting moment right here. That's why I wanted to stop here, because in a second, we're going to see exactly why Elisha weeps. But I think that we're also supposed to hang in the ambiguity, like, but I think there's supposed to be some ambiguity in regards to this, because to me, it's very similar to Jesus weeping during the triumphal entry, right? To where it's a moment where you're like, wait a second, something's wrong, right? Like whenever Jesus is riding in on a donkey, and everybody's cheering his name, and they're saying, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. It seems like such a good moment until the Gospels tell us that Jesus starts crying. And you're like, wait a second, am I reading this wrong? And then Jesus begins to explain not one stone is going to be left on top of the other. And you're like, oh, what's going on here, right? Very similar to right here. Because here you've got a prophet who goes up to visit the king of Aram. And at first you're like, ooh, is he a traitor? And then you're like, oh no, he's plotting against the king. And he's planning on having him, like, he's going to die. But then he starts crying. And you're like, wait a second. Shouldn't we be rejoicing that the king's going to die? Why is Elisha weeping? And the reason is actually kind of surprising. But it's precisely because Elisha knows more than anybody else in the room. Right? Because God does nothing without first revealing it to his prophets. So it says he fixed his gaze steadily on him until he was ashamed. You can just imagine the awkward silence here. Right? To where you've got Hazael and Elisha talking to each other. And Elisha says, the king is going to live. Yeah, he's going to live from the sickness. But he's going to die. And then he just looks Hazael in the eyes. And he doesn't say anything else. He just holds his gaze to the point of embarrassment. To where Hazael is getting uncomfortable from like this. It's an awkward moment. Like that's what this is. It is an awkward moment. And it's almost like he is looking into Hazael's soul. And Hazael realizes that Elisha's probably onto him. Because as we're going to see, very shortly after this, Hazael is going to kill the king. And so Hazael probably already had all this working in his head. And Elisha just looks at him. He says, oh yeah, the king. He's like, the sickness isn't going to be what kills him. And like, and Hazael's just like, he's like, this is uncomfortable. But it's not, like if anything, you would think that Hazael's the one who would go on to cry because he feels seen. But that's not what happens. Instead, it's Elisha who starts crying. And you've got to realize that Hazael's probably like, what the heck? Like, now this is even weirder. Why are you the one crying? And it's like, okay, strange. Let's go on and read what happens next. Rocky, go for it. Verses 12 to 15. I got to run to the restroom real quick.
Then Hazael said, why does my Lord weep? Then he said, because I know the evil that you will do to the sons of Israel. Their fortifications you will set on fire, and their young men you will kill with the sword, and their infants you will dash in pieces, and their pregnant women you will rip up. Then Hazael said, but what is your servant, who is but a dog, that he should do this great thing? Then Elisha answered, Yahweh has shown me that you will be king over Aram. So he went from Elijah and came to his master. And he said to him, what did Elijah say to you? And he said to me that you will surely be restored to life. Now it happened that on the following day he took the cover, dipped it in water, and spread it on his face. So he died. And Hazael became king in his place.
Wow.
Good timing. All right.
Interesting.
So what happens?
Hazael is just as confused as us. He's like, Elisha, why the heck are you crying? And then Elisha basically goes on to tell him that, like, you're going to cause so much destruction to Israel, and I have already foreseen it, that I can do nothing but cry.
Yeah.
And then Hazael is basically putting himself down. He's like, I'm your servant, I am but a dog. What would allow me to do these things that you describe?
Yeah.
And Elisha's basically like, the Lord has shown me that you will become the king. And so after hearing that, Hazael goes back to Aram, back to Ben-Hadad, and when Ben-Hadad asks him, what did Elisha say about me being restored from the sickness? Hazael's like, oh, he said you're going to be fine from the sickness. And then literally the next day after that, he basically suffocated him.
Yeah.
Waterboarded.
Yeah, basically. Yes, very weird story. And to me, I think this story right here probably highlights the complexity and the weirdness of being a prophet more than any other story. Because if you think about just all the things we've seen here, on one hand, Elisha leaves the land of Israel as judgment on the people of Israel, because God is going to the Gentiles. But then he predicts that the king of Aram is going to die, which seems like a good thing for Israel, because God is still blessing Israel. But then at the same time, Elisha is fulfilling the task given to Elijah to anoint the new king of Aram, which is judgment on Israel. And then he begins to weep because he knows how much destruction the new king of Aram, whom he just anointed, is going to cause on the people of Israel whom he loves. And all he can do is weep, because he knows that he is doing what God has commanded him to do, because this is the judgment of God, but that doesn't take away the pain of it, right? That's what you see, whenever you read the Old Testament prophets, that's what sticks out to me so much, is the pain that they feel in seeing what's coming. Because on one hand, they know that God's judgment is just and it needs to happen. But that doesn't take away the compassion you feel towards the people who have to suffer, right? And that's just what you see right here with Elisha, to where he's caught in such a weird place. He is literally being sent to anoint the future king who is going to cause the people of Israel to suffer. And he loves the people of Israel. And he knows that this king is not going to become king in a righteous way. This is literally God using evil to accomplish good, right? He's not he's twisting evil, right? He is taking mankind's evil and he is redeeming it to bring about good and honorable justice. But he's using wicked people. It's so interesting to where I think 2 Kings, you just see God's sovereignty through all of it. And it's a very, I understand why people get uncomfortable with God's goodness, honestly. I can see why people get uncomfortable with it, because God's goodness does not look like how we typically define morality, right? Because God's goodness actually transcends that, right? His goodness is so good that he can literally use evil to accomplish good. right? Whereas for us, we're playing a dangerous game if we're doing that, right? That's not really it's not in our capability to do that. We can redeem evil in the sense of whenever somebody does something evil against me, I can choose to forgive, right? I can do that, but I can't really do what God's doing here, right? This goes above that. And I can see why people get uncomfortable with that, but that's just, that's who God is, and as creator of the universe, it is his right to do that.
He's like the ultimate form of the ends, or the ends do justify the means, but whereas that's not necessarily,
Well, I think,
for individual.
so even beyond that, I think it's more like the idea that there are always two actors behind any given action, right? There's the human actors and there is God, right? And the human actors might be corrupt and evil, and they will be judged for that. But God is employing them to accomplish something good, right? Because God could hypothetically just like smite people from heaven, but he typically prefers to use humans to accomplish that, right? And so he will use these evil people to do that, but then the evil people will themselves be judged, right? So Ben-Hadad, he is going to be judged and killed for the things he has done. And so also will Hazael. But, I don't know, I just think it's very interesting. But, okay, just for the sake of time, we'll start speeding up a little bit. So Hazael says, "Why does my Lord weep?" Right? He's confused, right? This is just an awkward situation, very uncomfortable for all involved. Hey, Maverick. So it's uncomfortable for everybody. There's this awkward, extended eye contact, and he's just like, "Why are you weeping, Elisha?" And then he said, "Because I know the evil that you will do to the sons of Israel. Their fortifications you will set on fire, and their young men you will kill with the sword, and their infants you will dash in pieces, and their pregnant women you will rip up." Right? This is common language to describe the brutality of warfare. Right? It emphasizes the effect on the defenseless, right? Infants and pregnant women. Right? He says, the reason I'm weeping, you would almost think that the reason he's weeping is because of what the guy's going to do to Ben-Hadad. But Elisha doesn't really seem to, he doesn't seem that worried about Ben-Hadad. What Ben-Hadad is going to receive is really, Hazael isn't justified in his actions, but it is still judgment, right? What Elisha's crying over is that he sees beyond just what's going to happen the next few days. He sees what's going to happen over the course of the next few years. And he says, "I know what you're going to do. And it breaks my heart. Right? You are going to come after my people, and you are going to kill them." Then Hazael said, "But what is your servant who is but a dog that he should do this great thing?" He says, "I'm a nobody. How would I even accomplish such a thing? Right? Who am I?" Notice that he doesn't say that I would never do such a thing. He says, "I don't have the means," basically. He says, "I'm nothing." Right? He doesn't say, "I love the people of Israel." No. He doesn't say that. He simply says, "I'm but a dog. Right? I'm nothing. I have no power to accomplish that. What makes you think I could even do that?" And Elisha answered, "Yahweh has shown me you will be king over Aram." He says, "You may think you're just a dog, but Yahweh sees the future, and he already knows what you're plotting. You're going to be king. And whenever you have that power, you're going to use that power to afflict my people." So and that's just heartbreaking, because once again, Elisha, he knows this, and probably everything within him wants to kill Hazael, right? Because he loves the people of Israel. But that's not his job, right? Vengeance belongs to God. And as a prophet, he is simply here to proclaim the word of God. So he is here to say, you're going to be king, right? God has revealed that. So he went from Elisha and came to his master, and he said to him, "What did Elisha say to you?" And he said to me that you would surely be restored to life. He said that you will live. He didn't leave off he didn't put on the next part, but that's because Elisha told him not to. Right? So he does this exactly as Elisha commanded. Now it happened that on the following day, not 3 weeks later, not 7 months later, no, the following day, the day after he gets there, he took the cover and dipped it in water and spread it on his face, so he died. And Hazael became king in his place. This is how ancient cultures worked in the Near East. Nowadays, this is not how American government works, right? if you were to kill the president, that does not mean that you become the president, right? But in ancient cultures, that is how it worked. Because if you were able to kill a king, people viewed that as the gods giving their seal of approval to your right to reign, right? If you were able to get, because the kings, he's called Ben-Hadad, right? Son of Hadad, that's their god. If Hadad allowed Ben-Hadad to be killed, well, then Hadad must be giving his seal of approval to this guy to reign. And so that's kind of how it was. It's kind of a weird mentality, but that's, I'm not saying it should be that way nowadays, but I'm saying that I do respect how they viewed their gods as being, behind everything, right? Whereas in many ways nowadays, we talked about this a few weeks ago, we're kind of like deists in many ways. We like talking about God and stuff, but practically speaking, we almost attribute everything to natural means. And we forget that there's an active and living and breathing God who does do things. And so it seems like he probably just covered this up to make it look like it was part of the sickness, right? Oh, like, he doesn't do anything where he's not like strangling him or anything like that. He just covers up his face, and he probably argues, the sickness overcame him, when in reality, he suffocated the guy and really kind of waterboarded him, one of the two, or I guess both. But, so he made this look natural, right? Oh, well, the king's dead, and before he died, he put me in charge. I don't know. Or maybe he did make it public knowledge that he had killed him, and everybody said, okay, well, you're the king now. But the story continues. Verses 16 to 19. Go for it.
Now in the 5th year of Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, Jehoshaphat being then the king of Judah, Joram, the son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, became king. He was 32 years old when he became king and reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. And he walked in the way of the kings of Israel, just as the house of Ahab had done. For the daughter of Ahab became his wife, and he did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. However, Yahweh was not willing to make Judah a ruin for the sake of David his servant, since he had promised him to give a lamb to him through his son always.
Perfect. All right, so like I said, we're returning back to Judah for a little bit. In the rest of this chapter, we're going to see what's going on in Judah. And so if you remember Jehoshaphat, he was actually a pretty decent king, right? He was kind of foolish sometimes. But one thing that we saw was maybe not the wisest decision, but it was respectable about Jehoshaphat, is that he was the first king to really try to almost reunify the nation, right? And what I mean by that is that prior to Jehoshaphat, the kings of Israel and Judah had constantly been at war with one another. Whereas Jehoshaphat was willing to work with the kings of Israel to where, that's not reunifying the nation, but it's at the very least trying to at least be on speaking terms and partners, right? And so we saw Jehoshaphat partner with Ahab, and if you remember, Ahab died in battle during Jehoshaphat's time, and then he even partnered with Ahaziah as well, and Ahaziah also died. And so Jehoshaphat, he was a decent guy. And it even says good things about him. His son, not so much. And I think we're going to see here in these verses that maybe Jehoshaphat went a little bit too far in his willingness to accommodate the people of Israel. To where, in many ways, Israel and Judah become almost indistinguishable, which is not a good sign, right? Because Israel's really corrupt at this time. So in the 5th year of Joram, the son of Ahab, the king of Israel, Jehoshaphat being then the king of Judah, Jehoram the son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, became king. Does that sentence sound very strange to you? I think it's intentional. I think that the author's trying to kind of get your tongue a little bit tied, because it's like, this kind of goes to what I was saying about Judah and Israel being indistinguishable. What we're going to see in a second is that Jehoshaphat's son is related to Ahab, is going to become related to Ahab through a marriage and stuff like that. And in addition to that, what is Jehoshaphat's son's name? Jehoram. And if you look in other parts of the Bible, you know what this guy's shortened version of the name is? Joram. And so, at this time period, you have a man named Joram reigning in Israel, and a man named Joram reigning in Judah at the same time. On my little timeline over here, I did put Joram and Jehoram just to distinguish them, but their names are actually the same. Joram and Joram. Which, that's like there being like two Davids. I mean, David's a super common name. Joram was a common name back then. But what the author is trying to highlight is that Israel and Judah are kind of, maybe they're intermingling too much, right? Jehoshaphat was a good king, but I don't know. The legacy Jehoshaphat leaves behind is a son who looks a lot more like Ahab than he does like David. And, let's just read on. So, 5th year of Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, during Jehoshaphat's reign, Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, became king. So the idea is that they probably had a co-regency towards the end, right? So while Jehoshaphat was still king, he set up his son as king so that they could reign during the final year. So Jehoshaphat probably knew he was going to die soon, and so he puts his son also as king. He was 32 years old when he became king, and he reigned 8 years in Jerusalem. So how many years is he going to reign till he dies? 8. And how old is he going to be? 40. Good job. Just basic math.
Basic.
And he walked in the ways of the kings of Israel, just as the house of Ahab had done. That's not good. Especially because, once again, Jehoshaphat, he was one of the few kings where it said he was like David, right? He was a good king. He followed after God. His son, not so much, right? His son, he followed after Ahab. For the daughter of Ahab became his wife, and he did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. So we see that Ahab's daughter becomes Jehoram's wife. And so now Ahab would therefore be the father-in-law, and he would be brothers-in-law with Joram, king of Israel. Because Joram is also Ahab's son. So now you've got Joram, king of Israel, and his brother-in-law, Joram, king of Judah. It's very confusing. And this is one of those places where, whether you realize it or not, maybe your father-in-law might have more influence over you than you realize. To where, unfortunately, for Jehoshaphat, he married his son off into a bad family. And I can guarantee you this marriage probably happened as a result of political, probably alliance, right? He was probably trying to mix the nations, but the effect of this is actually the same effect of marrying pagan nations, right? Remember how Solomon, the thing that led Solomon astray was him marrying foreign women, and they led him astray? Well, now, here you've got a king of Judah who is marrying an Israelite woman, but he's being led astray. Because at this point, Israel has basically become a pagan nation, right? Which is sad. And so, even though he's marrying into this, he's being led astray. And, to be fair, I guess this woman is not entirely Israelite, because Ahab married Jezebel, who was Sidonian.
I was going to mention
Yeah.
it was like how Jezebel had led Ahab to Baal worship.
Yeah, and so there's all sorts of corruption here. He walked in the ways of kings of Israel, just as the house of Ahab had done, for the daughter of Ahab became his wife, and he did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh. So we've gone too far, they've intermixed too much, and Judah has become like Israel. However, Yahweh was not willing to make Judah a ruin for the sake of David his servant, since he had promised to give him a lamp to him through his son always. So he said, there's basically, if it were not for the everlasting covenant that God made to David, God would have wiped them out. But God is faithful. And therefore, he's going to be merciful. Right? And he's going to judge, but he's not going to destroy. But if he hadn't made that promise to David, he would have. Right? But he said, nope. I told David, 2 Samuel 7, that he's going to have a king always. His son is going to rule and reign forever. And therefore, I will not wipe them out. Moving on. Verses 20 and 23. Read loud and proud, Rocky.
In his days, was it Ahab? Edom revolted from under the hand of Judah and made a king over themselves. Then Joram crossed over to Zair and all his chariots with him. And he arose by night and struck the Edomites who were surrounding him and the commanders of the chariots, but his army fled to their tents. So Edom revolted against Judah to this day. then Lebanon. How do you pronounce that?
Libnah.
Libnah revolted at the same time. Now the rest of the acts of Jeram and all that he did, are they not written in the book of Chronicles of the kings of Judah?
Cool. So the only story that we read about from the reign of Joram is that the people of Edom rebelled. This is where Obadiah comes in. Because there's really only... So the book of Obadiah, fun fact, it is one of the few prophets that is not actually written to Israel or Judah. It is written to the people of Edom. And Obadiah, it's only one chapter long. It's the shortest book of the Old Testament. And it is a short one-chapter prophecy where Obadiah rebukes the people of Edom for rejoicing in Judah's hardship. And there's really two times where this could have taken place. It's either right here, during the days of Joram, or it would be hundreds of years later, whenever Judah falls to the Babylonians. And really, it's hard to determine which, but most people would lean towards it being this earlier time. And so that's why, hopefully, in a little bit, we will be able to do a little overview of Obadiah. Unless we just don't get to it, in which case that's fine. We can do that next week before we get into the other stuff. But yeah, so let's walk through it. In his days, Edom revolted from under the hand of Judah and made a king over themselves. All right. Old Testament history lesson. Who is Edom descended from? Esau. Yes. And so Edom and Israel, or Judah, they should have had like a brotherly relationship. But during the days of David, Edom was made basically a vassal state. Right? David was just like this amazing king who just like conquered and conquered and conquered. And no wonder that whenever the Messiah is called the Son of David, everybody expected the Messiah to be a conquering king. Because David was just like, he was just a warlord. And he made everybody subject to him. And so the Edomites had been subject to them. And it seems like for generations, the people of Judah had been the ones who got to decide who was ruling and reigning in Edom. But not anymore. Because apparently the Edomites looked at Judah and said, you know what? Y'all aren't as powerful as y'all used to be. We're going to declare our own king over us.
Didn't they rebel?
The Moabites rebelled before. Yeah, the Moabites rebelled. We read about them a few chapters ago. And I think in many ways, the reason why this is so short right here is because I think we're supposed to read the Moabite rebellion into the background of this. Because we got a very in-depth exploration of the Moabite rebellion against Israel. And so basically this story is almost a copy and paste situation where just how the Moabites recognized that Israel had been suffering and they rebelled, well, so the Edomites see that Judah is languishing and they rebel too. One thing I want to highlight about this, if you go way back to Genesis chapter 27, this is the story where Jacob steals Esau's birthright. If you remember, Esau was furious about this, and he goes to his father and he says, Father, don't you have any remainder blessing to give to me? And this is what Isaac responds. He says, Behold, away from the fatness of the earth shall be your habitation, and away from the dew of heaven from above. By your sword you shall live, and your brother you shall serve. But it shall be when you become restless, then you will break his yoke from your neck. So God promised that you will be a servant to Jacob. But one day you're going to get tired of it and you're going to rebel. Well, that's what's happening right here. Right? So in his days, Edom revolted from under the hand of Judah and made a king over themselves. Then Joram crossed over to Zair and all his chariots with him. And he arose by night and struck the Edomites who were surrounding him and the commanders of the chariots. But his army fled to their tents. So what happens?
It looked like he was winning the battle, but his army fled.
Yeah.
We don't know why.
Yeah, we don't know. Well, it seems like they're probably overpowered, right? They basically tried to do a sneak attack, right? So in nighttime, they get up and they're like, okay, we can take them out. And it turns out, nope, Edom was justified in the rebellion because Judah has gotten weak. But also, if Judah is losing a battle, what does that tell us?
Things are bad.
Yeah, rebellion.
Yeah, it tells us that they are rebelling against God, right? So little details like that, they're like, you can always just read the face value thing, but if you read the Torah into it, you have to let the Bible interpret itself. right? The authors of Scripture, this is how they save ink on their pens, right? They don't interpret everything for us. They expect us to have read the previous stuff, and we can interpret it for ourselves. We don't have to read. It doesn't have to say, and this is exactly how Joram lost the battle. All we need to know is that they lost. Because really, the mechanics of how doesn't matter. God decided they were going to lose, and therefore it was a losing battle to begin with. Right? And so that's really what this is highlighting. So Edom revolted against Judah to this day, and then Libnah revolted at the same time. I'm trying to remember exactly where Libnah is. What is Libnah?
Probably to the south of Judah.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking that Libnah is actually a city in... I thought it was a city like in Israel. But I could be wrong. Libnah was an independent city, probably near the western seaboard of Israel. Okay, so it was a city that it wasn't part of Israel, but it was like I guess a city that they did not themselves conquer, and it was kind of like a vassal place there. And so, in general, people are beginning to see that Judah itself is also languishing. Now, the rest of the acts of Joram and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? To which we'll say, well, yeah, they are, because we've got the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah in here. Assuming that book, the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, is the same as the books that we have, which are called 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Whenever it references the books of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, we don't have that for sure. Because 1st and 2nd Chronicles are specifically about Judah.
Okay, quick history check on the Chronicles of Israel. Was burned when the Ottoman Empire took over?
Maybe, I don't know. Like, the only time we have them mentioned is in Kings. And so, I mean, hypothetically, it could have been burned, but I have no idea. Yeah. All right. Moving on. 24 through 27. We only got a few verses left. Go for it, Rocky. Loud and proud.
So Joram slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David. And Ahaziah with his son became king in his place. In the 12th year of Joram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, Ahaziah, the son of Joram, king of Judah, became king. Azariah was 22 years old when he became king. He reigned 1 year in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was
Adaliah,
the granddaughter of Omir, king of Israel. He also walked in the way of the house of Ahab and did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, like the house of Ahab had done, because he was a son-in-law of the house of Ahab.
So this is where it gets even messier, right? This is even crazier. So what is this king's name? Ahaziah. And if you remember, there was also an Ahaziah king of Israel. That was Ahab's other son, right? Ahab had two sons who reigned over Israel. It was Ahaziah and Joram, right? And now you got Jehoshaphat has a son named Joram who reigns over Judah. And then Joram has a son named Ahaziah who reigns. And so Joram's brother-in-law was named Joram. And then Joram had another brother-in-law named Ahaziah. And then Joram had a son named Ahaziah as well. And then we also get to see that a lot of Ahab's family is intermingled with this. It's just like, as if it wasn't confusing enough already. You have like...
I think Atalia probably named Ahaziah that because of her brother.
Probably so. I imagine so. Alright, so let's walk through. So Joram slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David, so Jerusalem. And Ahaziah his son became king in his place. In the 12th year of Joram, the son of Ahab, king of Israel, Ahaziah the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, became king. Now, if you go back to 2 Kings chapter 3, this is another one of those places where verse 25 becomes a lot more ominous. 2 Kings chapter 3, verse 1. Now Jehoram son of Ahab became king over Israel at Samaria in the 18th year of Jehoshaphat king of Judah, and he reigned 12 years. So how long does Joram reign? 12 years. in the 12th year of Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, Ahaziah was the son of Joram, king of Judah, became king. So this is during the final year of Joram, right? So
What's going to happen?
yeah, it's almost like so already you're like, wow, that's ominous. And then it gets crazier. Ahaziah was 22 years old when he became king, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. This is quite an eventful year. So not only is Joram going to die in this year, but Ahaziah is too. Right? We're not, you can see we're right there in the year like 841. We're right there. Right? So he's 22 years old when he became king. He reigned 1 year in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Athaliah.
Are we about to get a queen of Judah?
Yeah, if you notice. Right? Yeah, there's going to be a whole story behind this too. And his mother's name was Athaliah, the granddaughter of Omri, king of Israel. So Athaliah is the granddaughter of Omri, which means that she is the daughter of Ahab, right? And so I'm assuming that this is the daughter of Ahab who was married to Joram, king of Judah, because that would make sense, right? Because it said he was married to a daughter of Ahab. And so Athaliah is the granddaughter of Omri. And so think about this. Like you said, Athaliah is going to become queen. So you are going to have a descendant of Ahab ruling on the throne in Judah. Right? And she's not descended from David. Right? So it's going to be really messed up. Like, that's how corrupt things are going to go. Like, Jehoshaphat, godly guy. His policies really messed things up quite a bit. It's like, he's like, why can't we all get along? Because there's certain people you just can't get along with, right? Because you have to sacrifice your standards. And that's kind of what's happening here. He also walked in the way of the house of Ahab, and did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, like the house of Ahab had done, because he was a son-in-law of the house of Ahab. Yeah. So Athaliah probably names him after her brother, right? She doesn't have a problem with what their family's been doing, and so she's like, hey, let's just raise them up doing the same stuff. And so, not a good guy, right? Womp womp, right?
You get to worship a cow.
Yeah. We could do That's actually funny. All right, last two verses of the chapter. Look at that, we're making good time.
Then he went with Joram, the son of Ahab, to the war with Hazael, king of Aram, at Roth Gilead, and the Arameans struck Joram. So King Joram returned to be healed in Jezreel for the wounds which the Arameans had caused by striking him at Ramah. When he fought against Hazael, king of Aram, then Hazael, how do you pronounce that name?
The Ahaziah.
Ahaziah, the son of
Jehoram.
Jehoram, king of Judah, went down to see Joram, the son of Ahab, in Jezreel because he was sick.
It's to the point where, like, it makes my head hurt trying to keep track of all of it.
Yeah.
And I do think that is intentional. Like, I think that is literally the author's point. I think the author is wanting to frustrate you to where you have to reread it 5 times just to distinguish between Israel and Judah. And I think that's just like his, like, it's just like a literary technique of frustrating you, because you're supposed to be frustrated with the corruption that's seeping in. What's that?
In the name.
Yeah. So he went with Joram the son of Ahab. So who went with him? Ahaziah. But this is Ahaziah king of Judah, not Ahaziah king of Israel. So Ahaziah went with Joram. Keep in mind, Joram also had a brother named Ahaziah. Not the same Ahaziah, right? This is Ahaziah the
brother-in-law?
like, well, no, I guess this would be his like nephew, kind of.
Yeah.
So this is the nephew of Joram. It's confusing, right? I don't even know. Like, are they nephews? I guess so, right? So Ahaziah, king of Judah, went with Joram, the son of Ahab, to war with Hazael, king of Aram, at Ramoth Gilead. If you remember, Ramoth Gilead is the place where Ahab died. And the Arameans struck Joram. Hey, that's what Elisha predicted, right? Elisha predicted that Hazael is going to become king and that Hazael is going to kill a bunch of Israelites. It's happening. So King Joram returned to be healed in Jezreel. right? So whenever it says it struck Joram, it doesn't mean just the battle. Like, it means, like, Joram himself was injured during the battle. So King Joram returned to be healed in Jezreel of the wounds which the Arameans had caused by striking him at Ramah when he fought against Hazael, king of Aram. Then Ahaziah, the son of Jehoram, king of Judah, went down to see Joram, the son of Ahab, in Jezreel because he was sick. Real quick detail. Where does Ahaziah, king of Judah, live?
In Jerusalem.
Jerusalem, which is north or south of Jezreel.
South?
South. Yeah, very good. If you're picturing it in your head, right? Because Judah in general is south of Israel, right? So Jezreel is in the north, Jerusalem is in the south, yet it says that Ahaziah went down to see Joram. Why is that?
It's talking about a spiritual, like it's a less spiritual place, maybe.
Yeah, so in general, I think, have we talked about this here? Where like,
To an extent, yeah.
the Bible, it doesn't talk geographically, it talks topographically. Right? You gotta realize ancient cultures, they didn't use maps like we do nowadays. Right? They had maps, but honestly, even into the time of like ancient Rome, they didn't really use maps as much as they did like landmarks. Right? Because they really didn't have a way of
And
like.
because Jerusalem sits on a hill, you'd be going.
Yes. Yeah. And so the Bible, it talks in like topographical terms. So it's more talking about like people go up and down based on hills, right? You go down to valleys, you go up. But what's interesting about that is that Jerusalem is actually not that big of a hill. But in the Bible, there is not a single moment when you will hear somebody going up from Jerusalem. And that is because even though Jerusalem isn't a huge hill, in many ways, from a biblical worldview, it is the largest hill there is. And that is because that is the place where heaven and earth meet, because that is where God himself dwells. Right? And so you can only go down from Jerusalem. And that's why there's so many songs in the Psalms, which are Psalm of Ascents. Right? It's where they sang them going up the hill. And I think that's kind of interesting. But yeah, so Ahaziah, son of Jehoram, king of Judah, he went down to see Joram, the son of Ahab, in Jezreel because he was sick. Right? So they seem to be on a good, they're functioning together as a unit. They're on friendly terms, which is good for Israel, not so good for Judah. Right? And so that is where we leave off in chapter 8. Sound good? All right. One thing I want to address very briefly before we do a short little overview of Obadiah is I did want to talk about some archaeology. Right? In specific, we got a lot of archaeology. Oh, that's supposed to say archaeology on there. I typed this really quick, and so it says archaeolo. I think, honestly, the picture that I put there is in front. I think there's a black background, and I think it's in front of the text. But Hazael, he shows up in archaeology. He actually shows up in several places. I just wanted to highlight two of them because these two are relevant to the biblical stuff. So this is from the basalt statue of Shalmaneser III. And I don't know where the inscription is at on this statue. It might be on the back, or it might just be really small. But this is what we read. Hadad-Ezer passed away. Right? So it's referring to Ben-Hadad in the Bible. Right? Hadad-Ezer, he passed away. Hazael, son of a nobody, took the throne. He mustered his numerous troops, and he moved against me to do war and battle, fought with him. I decisively defeated him. I took away from him his walled camp. In order to save his life, he ran away. I pursued him as far as Damascus, his royal city, cut down his orchards. Right? So this is what Shalmaneser records in regards to his own victories and stuff like that. I just think that's so interesting that it calls Hazael a son of a nobody.
Son of a nobody.
Yeah. Well, no, but first off, it's funny. Like, that is like the biggest way to like just like own your enemy, right? Who are you? But what it also highlights is it highlights the historicity of the biblical account, right? Because even Hazael, by his own testimony,
He calls himself a dog.
yeah, he's like, I'm a dog, right? I'm nothing, right? He is not royalty. He was not born into royalty. And so what this lets us know, because I'm more saying this in response to like skeptics who say the Bible doesn't know what it's talking about. Well, apparently, whoever's writing Kings was not making up these events, right? Because these events, like it demonstrates that the author of Kings was not only aware of what was going on in Israel at the time, but he was aware of geopolitical conflicts and stuff like that. And he was aware that the person named Hazael was a son of a nobody. And the way that Ben-Hadad died was kind of ambiguous. It just says he passed away. It doesn't say he was murdered. It didn't say he died from an illness. He just passed away, right? And then Hazael, son of a nobody, became king in his place. So that reflects what the Bible says. Yeah, Rocky?
No.
Oh, I thought you were raising your hand. Okay. And then, so there's that. But then another thing, and this is actually even more significant biblically speaking because it's kind of cool. There's this thing called the Tel Dan Stele, or Stele. And the cool thing about this stele is that it corroborates many of the events that we have mentioned in 2 Kings. And so we're not going to read it every time one of those events is mentioned, but if you actually read through the whole stele, it mentions several of the kings of Judah. It might mention kings of Israel as well, but I think it mainly mentions the kings of Judah. And so there's several of those kings who are mentioned directly, and this thing dates back to the 9th century, which is really cool. And this stele also gives us our first extra-biblical reference to the, quote, house of David. To where the Bible talks about David a whole lot, right? But this is our first, like, non-biblical source from outside the land of Israel that does refer to a house of David. And while scholars aren't confident who put this stele up, we have very good reason to believe that it was Hazael himself who put it up. And so most scholars, not biblical scholars, like just like scholars in general, they believe Hazael was responsible for that. So I think that's kind of cool. And so every now and then I just want to highlight stuff like that because if anything, just to remind us that we're not just dealing with like fairy tales or myths. We're dealing with historical stuff that actually happened, which should reassure us of the fact that there is a true God who rules over all. Okay, real quick, I do want to wrap up our discussion of this chapter by just asking y'all very briefly, application, right? We've talked about the story in its original context. We've gotten excited about all that. What are some principles that we can take out of this that maybe, like, I don't know, teach us something about God, teach us something about us? Yes, Rocky?
Don't do evil in the sight of the Lord.
Yeah. Don't do what is evil in the sight of the Lord. Don't be like the kings of Israel. Maybe one thing to bring up, don't be unequally yoked with unbelievers. Right? Oftentimes you'll hear that New Testament verse quoted in regards to marriage, which is true, but I think what we see with Jehoshaphat and his descendants is that it's also dangerous just in general, right? We should be friends with anybody, and we should be willing to interact with anybody, but we have to exercise caution in how close we allow ourselves to get and how much influence we allow them to have in our lives, right? Because gravity falls downwards, right? And in the same way, it's very easy. It's easier for us to be pulled down than it is for us to lift up. And we do want to lift up, but it just means that we have to be very careful there, right? And so there's that. What's another application type thing or just principle that you want to highlight?
Don't ever worship a man. Instead, worship Yahweh.
Yeah, for sure.
Because man will fail. Going back to what Maverick just said, man will always fail you. God will never.
Yeah. Maybe be a little bit more general in your questions whenever you're interrogating a prophet. Don't ask, will this sickness kill me? Just say, am I going to die? Anything else? All right, cool. Y'all want to go to Obadiah? Okay, cool. All right, so for those of y'all who are watching online, this video is about to end. But by the time this is online, you'll probably also see another video, which is about an overview to Obadiah. So we will see y'all then.